Now, this is our first virtual version of this symposium, and it would not have been possible without none of the symposia that we hold, without the support of our sponsors, and particularly the Canadian Blood Services and the Center for Innovation, the Neiman Vickers Endowment Fund, Pfizer, Roche, Bayer, Mako Pharma, Alexion, Octapharma, and Grifols. These are our sponsors for this event and many other events, and we value their participation. So who was Norman Bethune? Why do we hold this event? So Norman Bethune was a Canadian physician born in 1890 in Gravenhurst in Southern Ontario. His father was a minister, but his ancestors were all involved in medicine and the creation, particularly of the medical school at University of Toronto. Indeed, he went to medical school at U of T, but he took a break to do what all Canadians do. He became a lumberjack. And then after another break, taking advantage of a little bit of his medical school training, he joined the forces in World War I in Flanders Field as a stretcher bearer. Returned from there to Toronto, not particularly well, but joined the University of Toronto to graduate finally in an accelerated class of 1916, notable also for Frederick Banting, who of the insulin fame, who graduated the same year in that class. He was particularly ill after that, developed tuberculosis, had to have a lung collapse, which was the treatment of the day for his TB, managed to survive, and ended up as a surgeon at McGill University, where he was really a very creative surgeon, created all kinds of instruments that were used for decades subsequent to that, very involved in transfusion medicine in the earliest days, but was really an outspoken advocate of socialized medicine, labeled a communist, was essentially driven out of McGill and ended up around that time in Spain, which was undergoing a civil war, and became very involved in the early development of what is essentially a MASH unit, which was mobilizing hospitalized care to the battlefield, which had never been done. And that meant creating these sort of trucks that were refrigerated to carry blood from the blood transfusion units to the soldiers in the field, which had not been done before, and which is why the soldiers all died before they got back to the city. He was still an outspoken character at that time, and then was essentially forced out of Spain as well. And at that time then went to China, where the Japanese had invaded China and the Long March was going on. And this is where he became particularly labeled as a communist, but really what he was there for was to provide medical care to the people in the communities along the way, and the mostly peasants, and training the medical personnel. So he, as a consequence, became revered in China, and there are many, many Bethune hospitals throughout China. He's a little more controversial character in North America and in Canada for his political views, but we're not here to celebrate his political views. Particularly, we're here to celebrate the fact that he contributed so much to medicine and to socialized medicine, to provide it for all, and particularly his advances in delivering blood to those in need. So we hold this annual Norman Bethune Symposium at our Center for Blood Research, and we're really fortunate to have Dana Devine, who really leads the effort in creating this program every year, and that she's supported by key personnel, Mira, who's our office manager, Stephanie Mack, who's our education program manager, and Christine Ho is our communications coordinator. And before, I'm going to hand the mic over to Christine for a couple of minutes, but before I do want to remind everybody that this symposium is an interactive symposium. As challenging as this might be, the talks, which will all be right on time, I'm sure, allowing time for questions by all. We do want you to participate. Please, please do ask questions. This is particularly aimed at the trainees, students, but everybody, please ask questions through chat, and we'll open up the mics as well if you prefer. We're happy to hear voices and to see faces if possible. We're not too concerned about the time. We should have lots of time, but we have lots of speakers, so we do want to stay on time. There is an evaluation electronically at the very end. Hopefully will remember to remind you towards the later time. And we will have a couple of health breaks, one in the morning and the afternoon, and one midway that's a little longer. All right, so you can hopefully eat something. All right, so Christine, I'm going to give you this slide and you can jump in.
Great, perfect. Thank you, Ed. So I just wanted to invite you all to engage with us on social media. I will post these links in the chat, but we'll be live tweeting on Twitter throughout the day. And if you are going to share your Norman Bethune experience, please do feel free to tag us. Additionally, we'll be having a Twitter research showcase where trainees will be sharing their research in 4 to 6 tweets. So I'd encourage you to engage with them there as well, and I'll post the link to that in the chat. Thanks, Ed.
Okay, and I'll at each of the breaks, these couple of slides will rotate, so you'll see them for 10 minutes, morning, afternoon, and during sort of the lunch time. All right, thanks, Christine. Okay, so now I'm handing this over to Dana, all right, to introduce our first speaker.
Great, thanks very much, Ed, and welcome everyone to today's symposium. We'll probably be stumbling through a little bit of this as we go, since it is the first time trying to do this, so hopefully you'll bear with us. I would certainly my pleasure to introduce our very first speaker, who is Dr. Graham Sher from Canadian Blood Services. And Graham has an interesting way of describing himself when we asked him for a bio, and I'm just going to read it to you, not to embarrass him, but I think it says a lot about Graham's real interest in transfusion medicine and why he's stayed with us for so long. So Graham describes himself as a relentlessly curious health systems executive who's always trying to peer around corners and understand the future. He is a hematologist by training, and Graham has been the Chief Executive Officer of Canadian Blood Services for longer than was his original plan, but has always found the next horizon too interesting to avoid. One of Graham's other main passions is exploring the globe, always with his camera gear in hand, preferably while hanging out of a helicopter to get the aerial view. And for those of you who enjoy photography, you can Google Graham and it'll take you to his photography website where there are some spectacular photographs. So Graham, now that I've outed your photography, please feel free to take over. Ed, are you going to drive the slides, or?
I am. Is that okay? Graham, just
yeah, that's perfect. Thanks, Ed. Well, thank you, Dana, and thank you to the organizing committee for the opportunity. As Ed said when we got online at the beginning, I was actually a speaker at the very first Bethune Symposium, so delighted to be asked to come and speak again, even though this time it is virtual, which is, of course, the new way of doing business. When Dana and Ed asked me to make a few opening remarks, I was giving some thought as to what topic would be most relevant. And it's no big surprise that I think the issue that is dominating everybody, no matter what role you're in, no matter what institution you're in, no matter what function you're performing, is the current pandemic and the implications of the pandemic, short, medium, and long term, on the organizations and the jobs that we all do. So next slide, please. So I decided to just do a bit of a cook's tour at a very high level as to what COVID-19 may mean for blood systems. And what I'll share with you in the next few slides is just a bit of a teaser. I know that our good friend, Dr. Mel Crashton, will be talking to you in the symposium later today about COVID-19, and no doubt he'll offer a much more scientifically informed view than I will. Mine is really more about some of the global perspectives, some of the horizon scanning opportunities, and what organizations need to think about as we look into the future. Next slide. So one of the interesting ways of thinking about what has this pandemic brought to us is shown on this slide here, and this is borrowed from the consulting company Gartner. And they've really said there are two fundamental opportunities and disruptions that organizations need to think about. One is the duration of the disruption. So how long is this going to go on for? And the longer it goes on for, the greater the impact. And what is the extent and the nature of the behavior changes that the pandemic has wrought on society? And one needs to think about those behavior changes very broadly, from individual behaviors to institutional behaviors, government behaviors, legislative changes, and so on. And the longer those changes remain in place, the greater their impact will be down the road. Next slide. So I think the only thing we know for certain is that the pandemic has shown us that uncertainty and volatility are here and likely here to stay for a long time. And this quote from KPMG, I think, is fairly telling. It's a story with an uncertain ending. We don't really know where this is going. It's introduced new challenges to the business environment, that goes without saying. And it's almost certain that whatever the new normal is will be different from that which existed. If you wouldn't mind just going back, Ed, I think the slides are jumping. So, whoops, no, one forward. Thank you. So I think it's true that many organizations, institutions, governments, public health agencies have believed for a very long time that the pandemic was in the offing. Everyone sort of had it on their risk profiles. But I think despite all of us having it on our risk profiles, we were ultimately caught off guard in that the timing and the nature of the current event have perhaps turned out to be even bigger than many of us might have contemplated. And so the extent now of what we do to get out of the current situation is really the question that remains. And if you look at the last line on the slide, many organizations remain trapped in mental coordinates of a world that no longer exists. Next slide. So one of the things we're thinking about at Canadian Blood Services is what has the impact of the pandemic been on the consumer? And the consumer really could be anyone. It could be the donor, it could be a recipient, it could be an employee. And in all of these ways, we need to think that the consumer's mindset has changed. Individuals have become more aware and socially conscious of health and public health issues. We've all had to embrace new ways of working. The very fact that we're doing this virtual symposium is an example of that. And there's no doubt that the digital world is now going to accelerate, even as it was accelerating before pandemic. It's going to accelerate in dramatic ways that we hadn't contemplated before. Next slide. So how should blood services specifically engage with this changing universe and the changing consumer mindset? Well, for sure, we need to think about new products and services for donors, for employees, and very importantly for the patients we serve. We need to understand the expectations of stakeholders, and critical stakeholders in our world would of course be donors, but not only donors. We need to look at all opportunities for technology acceleration, and I'll speak to a couple of those in a minute. The impact of data sharing and privacy has become a massive issue, and we need to understand how all of those dimensions of data and privacy are going to change over the next number of years. Next slide, Ed. In addition to that, we have to understand what governments are doing at a policy level, and we as a blood service certainly want to align ourselves with changes in government policy. We need to look at the changes that are occurring at the health delivery level. So is healthcare going to become more virtually delivered, more home care delivery? Is there an opportunity for us in the blood universe to think about changes in healthcare treatments and what our role can be? And I'll talk about that in a moment. One of the ways that certainly our world has become upended is in the whole global supply chain, and I'll talk about that in a sec. The way we interact with, communicate with donors, and digital technologies and offerings. And of course, because we're in a publicly funded health system, and it was very appropriate in Ed's introduction with Norman Bethune to think about socialized medicine, all of these changes are happening to us at a time when fiscal restraint is going to be the new way of looking at the world as well. Next slide. So we at Blood Services, we've worked with other blood services, particularly in Australia, the US, and the United Kingdom, are trying to think of the factors that are most likely going to impact on us and those that we need to be aware of. And I think we can summarize them in these 6 main areas, and I'll have a slide on each. So next slide. I'll talk firstly about politics and power. And I think one of the things the pandemic has shown is that there might have been an opportunity to address this at a more global, integrated, and consistent manner. But unfortunately, I think to a large extent that global approach was missed. And what we are left with is a number of hodgepodge individual national responses, not necessarily well coordinated. And global entities such as the World Health Organization, which could have and arguably should have had a more leadership role in managing a global pandemic. In fact, you've seen a significant erosion of trust in entities, and it's not just WHO, but many entities like that, for a whole variety of political reasons, good and bad, have seen an erosion of trust at the global level. And you're seeing countries having to deal with these responses at individual national levels. And as a result, you're seeing issues such as protectionism, a reduced globalism, and an enhanced need for domestic self-reliance. And I'll talk about that in a sec as well. Next slide. Global supply chains have certainly been an area of dramatic concern, and it's not just for blood services, it's pretty much for every sector. But in our world, if we just think about where our blood bags are manufactured, where our test kits are manufactured, in the case of Canada, where most of our plasma protein products derive from, we're heavily, heavily reliant on global supply chains. And the pandemic in the first few weeks and months put all of those supply chains at risk. And so if I think some of the actions that we've had to take at Canadian Blood Services, it is about shoring up our dependence on those global supply chains and creating much greater domestic stock holdings so that we wouldn't be as much exposed to disruptions in the supply chain were they to occur for long periods of time. You've all heard about the company 3M, and they're producing masks early on in the pandemic, and then there was the threat by the Trump administration and the US government to essentially sequester all of the personal protective equipment to stay in the United States. So that put companies and countries rather like Canada at great risk until we were able to address our own needs on personal protective equipment and ventilators and other needs. So the whole sort of reliance on a global supply chain has been dramatically exposed as a risk. And as a consequence, all of us need to focus now on domestic self-sufficiency and domestic security of supply. And that cuts across all parts of the health system, not just the blood system. Next slide. From a social and human development point of view, one of the things we're paying very careful attention to, as are many other entities, organizations, and sectors, is this notion of resilience rather. So how do we build resilience into all of the processes for which we are responsible? So the disruption, and I sort of said this from a human behavior point of view in the very first slide, has been bigger than any of us might have predicted, and it's certainly unprecedented in human history. Massive unemployment, digital disruption in a way that was coming, but was coming much more slowly. What was becoming an urbanized society, now in some ways you're seeing people retreat away from urban density and into more rural and less dense environments. As yet unmeasured and untold psychological impacts and long-term mental health impacts on society, which will likely dwarf any of the infectious disease burden caused by the virus itself, and this whole notion of the impact of data sharing and privacy. So we need to think about that from an impact on employees, on donors, and on the patients we serve. Next slide. And an economic basis, I mentioned this briefly a minute ago, but governments really have been hit in some ways in three different dimensions. Firstly, all governments, and the government of Canada included, have had to provide public policy measures to try to stabilize the economy. So massive, massive degrees of spending by governments in very short order just to stabilize the economies. The action that provincial and federal governments have had to take in Canada and around the world to manage and suppress the virus to the extent possible, and we're not out of that yet and certainly won't be until vaccines become widely available. And then how do you allow society to go back to work in some sort of reasonable degree of normalcy, all of the implications of that. And all of this happening at a time that essentially governments are finding themselves significantly financially constrained. Next slide. So the global economy has taken a massive hit, and that of course is going to have a hit on all of us who are publicly funded, whether you're in an academic environment such as a university, or whether you're in a service delivery environment such as a blood service, or a direct patient care environment such as a hospital. At the end of the day, we're all dependent on public funding, and we're going to have to make changes for many years to come. And although there is going to be an economic rebound for sure, and we're already beginning to see some of that now, it's going to take many, many years for organizations to really normalize to the extent that we will normalize in a new normal. Next slide. Technology, I talked about this in my introductory slide, but I like this quote here, that overnight we've seen digital transformation. Welcome to the year 2025, 60 months early. And there is no doubt that we were on a digital and robotics transformation even before the pandemic. We've all been going down those paths for some years now, but the degree to which that is being accelerated in a post-pandemic universe is unlike anything anyone had imagined a short 6 months ago. So the deployment of artificial intelligence, robotics, robotic process automation, all of these novel technological disruptions are going to come to us in a way that we perhaps had not thought might come to us, or certainly not at the speed with which we had potentially anticipated only a few months ago. So I think this notion that we're going to discover and deploy automation to essentially operate in as much of a contactless environment as is possible. And so if you think about a blood service, where of course our reliance on collecting blood from human donors relies on physical contact, we have to think about what are the disruptions that are going to come in our collection, manufacturing, and distribution environments that will essentially rely on technology and lack of human contact to the extent possible. Next slide. So obviously the whole health systems are going to change. I talked about that before, and we haven't yet seen the full impact of that. And as health systems delivery change, we need to think about our role in blood services and in supporting the delivery of health systems, how we need to change in concert with the fundamental changes to healthcare delivery in a new normal coming post-pandemic. Next slide. So what are the silver linings we as a blood service can find in all of this? Well, firstly, we need to find our new feet, or our new footing in the global shifting political alliances, both nationally and internationally. We need to find ways of collaborating with governments in ways that we hadn't before. And perhaps one of the paradoxical outcomes of this pandemic is that trust in governments and government institutions may in fact go up when in fact it had been quite weak before pandemics, because without the intervention of governments at the provincial and national level, I think all of us as citizens of society recognize we would be a lot worse off. So if there is increasing trust in government, how do we as publicly funded entities leverage that trust? Talked about the impacts of economic disruption and how we find new ways of acquiring funding and reimbursement in a post-pandemic universe. And we need to understand that there is likely going to be the impact of competition from the private sector in ways that may not have existed before the pandemic. And I think we haven't yet seen the full impacts of that in Canada. Next slide. I've talked about the disruptions in supply chain and ways to mitigate that. How do we address domestic security of supply, and how do we bring manufacturing onshore when we had in fact been reliant on offshore manufacturing? How do we bring productivity and efficiency into our operations as we manage the very tight fiscal environment? And what are all the impacts of COVID-19 on the behaviors of our donors, of our employees, and of those that we serve? And how do we create environments where people feel safe and well to come to work, to come and donate, and to continue to support the organizations that at the end of the day depend on human behavior? Next slide. Lots of work that we as a blood service can do to support the evolving science and the epidemiology, and I'm sure you will talk more about this in the rest of the symposium. But as some of you may know, we at Canadian Blood Services have been supporting national seroprevalence data, and I suspect you'll hear from Dr. Krashton about this later on in the day. We've also been supporting the national clinical trials on convalescent plasma. What work can we do in Canada to support the manufacturing and provision of hyperimmune globulins for COVID-19, if that becomes an important therapy? So we as a blood service have a variety of roles we can play to support novel therapeutic interventions where we may not have been doing those just a few number of months ago. How do we support donors, employees, and prepare them for the new normal, accelerating digital transformation and the new work environment? And at the end of the day, how do we embed all of these significant changes to health and technology into the blood sector so that we're not finding ourselves caught flat-footed and behind all of these changes that are occurring in society around us? Next slide, and I think it's one of my last slides. So at Canadian Blood Services, we're looking at all of these things in a coordinated strategic approach, and these four bubbles on the slide are really the ways that we're looking at our new future. So how do we build resilience and agility? What are the changing products and services that we want to provide to the patients that we ultimately serve? How do we build increasing domestic self-reliance and domestic self-sufficiency? And how do we constantly respond to these changing societal norms? And to do all of that, I think the last slide then, Ed, to do all of that, we need to understand that there is certainly a lot of risk ahead in society on an ongoing basis, but what are the opportunities that we can identify in this risk environment, and how do we appropriately seize those opportunities and modernize our environment? And I'll stop there. I'm hopefully within my time, and would be happy to answer any questions if there are.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Graham. I think that what we'd like to try to do for questions is you can either type your question into the chat box. So there should be a bar at the bottom of your screen that says chat. If you click on that, you can type your question in there. Or the other way to do this is to actually put your hand up, and
you can unmute yourself as well.
Yeah, and you can unmute yourself. So maybe while people are figuring out how to run Zoom, Graham, I'd just ask you if you might just say a word or two about this, speaking of taking advantage of the opportunities presented by COVID, is just to say a little bit about the use of blood donor samples for understanding some of the epidemiology of COVID.
Certainly, and again, I'm sure Mel will speak to this later in the symposium, but in the early weeks of the pandemic, a number of us at Canadian Blood Services recognized that we could support the national efforts to understand the epidemiology of the virus, and particularly to try to understand what percentage of the population may have been exposed and not be aware of that. So because we collect somewhere in the order of 15 to 18,000 samples from healthy individuals every week, that's the number of donors who every month, should I say, who come through our system every month, we recognize that we're sitting on a little bit of a gold mine. So we collect blood and we collect all the samples that we need to test from every blood donor, and we typically store those samples for 7 days after a blood donation, and then we discard them. I was speaking to some folk on my team to say, why would we discard them? Why don't we hang on to those samples and then identify the appropriate partners to work with to see if we could contribute to the national data bank, if you want, of emerging seroprevalence studies. And so the federal government early on in the pandemic announced the Canadian Immunity Task Force, of which Dr. Krashton is a member. And one of the task force's mandates was to seek easy and rapid ways to measure the seroprevalence of COVID-19 across sectors of the society in Canada. Now, of course, blood donors are not fully representative of Canadians. You can only donate if you're over the age of 17. We only have healthy people donating, and there are certain individuals who can't donate because of our eligibility criteria. But it's a reasonable representation across the geography of Canada. And so we sort of put our hands up to the Immunity Task Force, and we said that we would be willing to collaborate and partner with you because we're sitting on a readily available source of human serum samples that could be used to measure antibody exposure using a variety of assays that were in the process of being validated and developed. And so the Immunity Task Force identified this as a quick win for the country. We entered into a partnership with them. And as a result of that, we have now banked serum samples from donors from about the first week of May, end of April, beginning of May, right through to the current period. Just in fact, today, there's a big announcement out that the first 40,000 of those samples, the results have been released. And what we're seeing in Canada across all provinces, with the exception of Quebec, where we don't operate, is about 0.7% of blood donors have evidence of antibody exposure to COVID-19, so less than 1%. The data in Quebec is a little bit different. It's just over 2% there in Hema-Quebec samples, which perhaps is not surprising given the very high prevalence of the pandemic in Quebec in the early months. So this is just one data point, Dana. It's certainly not the totality of national seroprevalence data, but it was an opportunity for the Blood Service to leverage its capabilities and its resources and to support the country in gathering some very quick data on Canadian seroprevalence with respect to C19.
Thank you, Graham. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, Graham, so it's Ed. The impact on donors in Canada and the United States, for example, and then beyond, and then beyond the developed world, what are the impacts now?
It's a great question, Ed, and I will be brief just to allow you to stand. They have changed over the months of the pandemic. So in the first few weeks, sort of mid-March through till almost May probably, our single biggest concern was that donors would stop coming to donate because they would feel that a blood donation event was a public gathering and that was inconsistent with the early advice around avoid public gatherings, avoid physical contact and what have you. So our very early concerns that in fact we would see a dramatic decline in blood donations. And in fact that happened. It happened in Canada, it happened in the US. Fortunately, the demand for blood also fell at the same time. And in Canada, we were able to reasonably well balance the decline in demand with the decline in supply, donations that we had seen. The United States, interestingly, had a much worse outcome early on because their ability to collect fell off even greater than their dramatic decline in demand. So they actually got into very, very precarious places early on in the pandemic. We were in sort of trouble, but we were sort of able to keep our head above water. Then we very quickly engineered processes to reassure donors. So we put in as much physical distancing as we could. Our staff were given personal protective equipment. Donors were made to wear masks. We put in physical barriers where it's possible to do that. And we made sure that Canadians and donors understood that although our collection environments required people to gather in a physical place, to the extent possible, we adhered to as many of the public health measures as possible. And all the public health officers in the country did a fantastic job reminding Canadians that it was important to give blood even in a pandemic. And in fact, we then got into a position where we almost had too much blood in the country because we had such a resurgence in blood donors coming back because they were advised by public health experts to come and donate, and the supply had not returned. The demand had remained low. So in the latter weeks, we then got into a situation of we were actually sitting on excess blood and at risk of outdating it. Now we've been able to normalize that again, where our supply and our demand are more aligned. but it's a very volatile environment, and we need to pay very careful attention to that. And my last point that I would make is, fortunately in Canada, we've seen very, very few donors call us after a donation event and say they've had COVID-19. So we've had very few instances, literally you can count them on one hand, where we've had to then go back and notify our staff or other donors that they may have been in a public health gathering with somebody who's subsequently diagnosed with COVID-19. So we've had very, very few instances of those. And that's been, I think, part of the public health success in this country overall.
Great. Thank you very much, Graham.
All right. And I'm sorry I have to leave you folk and get back to a board meeting, but thanks for the opportunity. Enjoy the rest of the symposium.
Thanks very much. Good luck with the meeting.
Take care.
Bye. Okay, so we're going to move on now, and I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Karen Nelson, who is at Bloodworks Northwest in Seattle. So she's in the smoky part of the Pacific Northwest these days. She is the Vice President of Laboratories at Bloodworks Northwest, and she is the Director of the Immunogenetics and HLA Laboratory, and also the Director of the Transfusion Service Laboratories. Karen's research is really focused on the manipulation of the immune response in transplantation and transfusion. And I asked her if she would come talk to us today about some very interesting work that she's been doing in this area. In addition to her research activities, Karen has served as the president of the American Society of Histocompatibility and Immunogenetics, and is also on the board of directors of UNOS. She actively publishes her work in lots of journals that we all know well, and writes book chapters and is a feature at many national conferences. So Karen, I'm going to stop bragging about you and let you take over so you can tell us what's going on in the world.
Well, thank you, Dana, and thank you for that introduction. Just one correction, all of that is now in the past tense, as I now have officially retired. But I do really want to talk today about studies that we did in Seattle about transfusion and related immunomodulation. I want to thank the committee for inviting me to come present our work here. And what we were interested in doing in this study was really exploring mechanisms that could be behind this phenomenon. So could I have the next slide, please? Or can I do them myself? Nope, okay. I want to start out by acknowledging, first of all, the participants in this prospective randomized clinical trial, whose data we'll discuss today. First of all, the cardiac surgery clinical team at the University of Washington, under the direction of Dr. Gabriel Aldia, who was responsible for not only for selecting patients who met the criteria, consent, but the research nurses on that team were absolutely key in providing follow-up and getting follow-up samples for the study. The Transfusion Service Laboratory at Bloodworks Northwest was the laboratory for that service during this study and was responsible for randomizing patients to particular arms to get blood products prepared in a certain way we'll talk about here in the next slide. And also they were the ones that were ensured that the patients, once randomized to an arm to receive a particular type of blood component, received that component from the standard inventory. The laboratories back to the previous slide, please. The laboratories at Bloodworks Northwest were involved in the testing and with this, acknowledging Dr. Cheryl Slichter for her guidance and support. She was also the PI for the NHLBI SCORE grant that supported this study that's identified there, and also then the two references for where you can find the study in clinicaltrials.gov and was published last year in Transfusion. Next slide, please. So transfusion-induced immunomodulation, the way we are going to do it for this study, or the definition, is really looking at adverse events following blood transfusion, allosensitization, both antibody and cellular, and a generalized immunosuppression that in other studies has read out looking at increased morbidity, mortality, increased hospital stays. But our goal was really to evaluate this, what mechanisms might underlie these phenomena in immunocompetent recipients of red cells and platelets. And the immunocompetent is key because studies prior to when we did this one were performed in individuals who were undergoing stem cell transplantation or chemotherapy for different kinds of cancers, and therefore their immune systems may not have been as robust. So what we were interested in looking at, what was the effect of transfusion with components prepared by pre-storage leukoreduction or pre-storage leukoreduction and irradiation. And then as controls, we're comparing them to recipients of unmodified blood products and no transfusion. Next slide, please. So a brief overview of what the study was. We focused on patients that were undergoing cardiac surgery with cardiopulmonary bypass. Patients received study transfusions, and by study transfusions, I mean the ones where they were randomized to receive either of the three different kinds of blood products, excuse me, the standard product, a leukoreduced or a leukoreduced irradiated product. And they were kept on that product for 5 days before and 30 days after their surgery. For our study, we collected blood prior to surgery and then at post-surgery on 2 different time periods. Froze sera from those collections, and then for a subset, we also isolated PBMC from whole blood and froze cells for studies. If we want to skip down then to the recruitment in patients, so we had 245 patients really who had full samples and follow-up for the study, for the antibody studies. And then a subset would plan to have the whole blood samples collected for the cellular studies. We had 139 patients who met that criteria and who were in the study. Now, this study was powered originally based on 80% of the patients receiving transfusions. However, in the last years of the study, fewer than 50% were getting transfused through any of these procedures. And this affected the statistics for the studies of the transfused groups, and I think it also documents the success of a push towards not so much bloodless surgery but reducing the exposure to transfusion products. What we did end up, though, there was a very robust non-transfused group who served as good controls for the effect of the procedures themselves on the immune systems that we were measuring. Next slide, please. So the test plan, HLA antibody testing, screening the samples, the 3 samples from each individual to see if there was any evidence of antibody to HLA class 1 or 2. And if any of those samples were positive, then they were reflexed to specificity testing using single antigen multi-arrays. Cytokine testing, we used ELISpot for PBMC that were producing TGF-beta1. And for other cytokines, we tested culture supernatant from PBMC cultures looking for, with a cytometic beta ray assay. The cells we looked at as mediators of generalized immunosuppression were invariant NKT cells and different subsets of T regulatory cells. We used flow cytometry phenotyping, including cytokines. So all samples from a patient were tested in the same assay. Pre-surgery samples then were the controls for the post-surgery samples. And the report we here is we're looking at the percent of patients showing an increase in the measured response in those post-surgery samples. And most importantly, laboratory staff was blinded to whatever study arm the patients were on until we were completed with testing and analysis. Next slide, please. So let's talk, this is sort of the design then of how we're going to report out these things. This is a study, are the results of patients who were positive for HLA antibodies in their pre-surgery sample. We divided the patients into 2 groups based on the pre-surgery sample testing. And these then show the individuals of each group that had increased antibody to HLA in their post-surgery samples. So down on the left-hand column, you can see that the first group was the ones who received no transfusion. The second group of STD are the ones who received the unmodified blood products, red cells and platelets. The third group is the one who received then the leukoreduced products, and the fourth group at the bottom, the leukoreduced irradiated, are the ones who received irradiated blood products. And as you can see, there was actually a significant number of individuals in the no transfusion group who showed an increase in HLA antibody after the surgical procedure. This has actually been reported by a number of groups. I think one of the first ones was from Johns Hopkins, that trauma can actually reactivate memory responses to antibody. As expected, the standard recipients of the standard products showed the greatest amount of reactivation of HLA antibody or new HLA antibody. Leukoreduction was able to reduce the proportion of patients making new antibodies, but not to any significant amount. Next slide, please. So this is the other group then with patients who did not have HLA antibodies in their pre-surgery sample. And some of these may have truly been non-sensitized patients who had never been exposed to transfusion before, but in case of, at least the memory response was sufficiently distant in that they did not have ongoing antibody responses. And as you can see, the group that didn't get transfused, very few of them, in fact, only 2 individuals showed an increase in antibody after, or appearance of HLA antibody after surgery. Again, as expected, recipients of the standard products show the greatest increase then in a number of individuals making HLA antibody after transfusion. And in this group, then you can see that leukoreduction did what we would expect it to do and definitely significantly decreased the proportion of patients then who were sensitized or showed antibody responses after surgery and transfusion. But what was surprising was the leukoreduced irradiated group, where we almost went back up to the levels of antibody positive individuals that we saw in recipients of standard. Next slide, please. So our observation is that leukoreduction was associated with a reduced generation of HLA antibody in previously non-sensitized patients. This is not new. But what was new was that recipients of leukoreduced irradiated products did not show that same reduction. Leukoreduction did not significantly reduce HLA antibody in pre-sensitized individuals. And this might explain some work, and especially the group that came out of the Winnipeg transplant group in the past, was showing that for patients who were on the wait list for kidney transplantation, really leukoreduction did not seem to have reduced the rate of sensitization after transfusion in those patients. And then the other piece was that surgery with cardiopulmonary bypass and cell savers, but without transfusion, led to increased antibody in pre-sensitized individuals. Next slide, please. So our plan to look at this general immunosuppression potential mechanisms was first to look at the cytokines. And so we looked at PBMC that were producing TGF-beta1. We looked at PBMC secreting cytokines in culture, invariant NKT cells, and T regulatory cells. And again, in each instant, the patient's pre-surgery sample was a control for the observations in the post-surgery sample. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of one of the ELISpot assays. We can talk through it. If we look at across the top, we could look at all 3 samples from this patient were tested in the same assay, day 0, day 11 post-surgery, day 26 post-surgery. We plated the PBMC at 3 different concentrations in order to identify a concentration that would give us a maximum number of spots without exceeding the level of the software to be able to identify it. So in this assay, the PBMC are plated into filter plates, and using combinations of antibodies and then substrate, each of those little dots is a cell that was secreting TGF-beta during the culture. And so for this patient, the 5 × 10⁻⁴ is the one that we used. And as you can see, there was a significant increase 11 days after surgery, and that increase continued on day 26 after surgery of the number of cells in this patient who were making TGF-beta. Next slide, please. So here's the summary for all of the patients. And what we found here is that the non-transfused group really showed a very robust increase after the surgery of patients' cells making TGF-beta, such that there really was no significant difference between any of these recipients. It seemed like the group, it appears that the group that received the leukoreduced irradiated products maybe had the lowest increase in TGF-beta producing cells after surgery or after transfusion in this case too, but that wasn't significant. Next slide, please. When we looked at cytokine production, let's look at the group up here that says IL-10. So the first bar, purple bar going across is our group who did not get transfused. The green bar are the ones that received standard transfusion products. The red bar, the leukoreduced transfusion products, and then the blue bar, the leukoreduced irradiated products. And that group made significantly lower levels of cytokine in culture as compared to the other three groups. Could I have the next slide, please? So when we look at regulatory cytokines, surgery and cardiopulmonary bypass increased levels of TGF-beta producing PBMC. If patients received leukoreduced irradiated transfusions, though, fewer showed an increase. The same surgery and bypass increased levels of IL-10 in the post-surgery samples. And if patients received these leukoreduced irradiated transfusions, fewer showed an increase, and this actually was statistically significant. And then the interferon gamma production was lower in all of the patients. In fact, it seemed like any of the patients receiving transfusions had a lower incidence of making interferon gamma than the ones who were just the non-transfused group. Next slide, please. So, invariant NKT cells, mediators of generalized immunosuppression. We identified them on flow cytometry scan by both looking at positive and negative for CD4, as well as positive for the 6B11, which was a monoclonal identifying a unique marker on human NKTs, and then looked at cytokines intracellularly. Next slide, please. So let's look at the top group, the CD4 invariant NKT, making IL-4. So this group of cells has been known to actually help antibody production in some cases. It definitely, because of the secretion of the IL-4 and the Th2 type cytokines, generally can skew immune responses to a more lower immunosuppressed level. And in this case, the non-transfused group, again, is the purple group on the top. The surgery and bypass alone did increase the number of these cells in the post-surgery samples. Transfusion with either standard product or the leukoreduced products increased the number of cells in the post-surgery samples for these patients and post-transfusion samples. But again, the leukoreduced irradiated group looked very different, and significantly fewer patients in that group showed an increase in those cells. Next slide, please. So with T regulatory cells and phenotyping, again, these cells are ones that are high in CD4, CD25, and then we looked at staining for FOXP3 or CTLA4 as functional markers of suppression. Next slide, please. So in this group, we looked first at those cells which were positive for FOXP3. In this group, the non-transfused group really showed very few showing an increase after transfusion, as opposed to the other markers that we'd looked at. The recipients of standard, which is the green line, and leukoreduced showed an increase in Tregs, but a much lower increase was seen in the group that got the leukoreduced irradiated blood. And this was even more pronounced than when we looked at the Tregs who were positive for CTLA4. Again, a very robust response of increase in regulatory cells in the recipients of standard and leukoreduced transfusions, and almost none in the group that got the leukoreduced irradiated. Next slide, please. So as we summarize this and look at the effects of transfusion on these mediators of TRIM, first of all, in allosensitization, we're looking at the appearance of HLA antibody. Recipients of standard products showed that expected increase in the amount of HLA antibody post-surgery and post-transfusion. This was less in the group that got the leukoreduced products. But the leukoreduced irradiated group, especially in the group that started out the process without being sensitized to HLA, showed a rebound and showed an increase in HLA antibody. So when we looked at potential mediators of the immunosuppression following transfusion, so we looked at the increased secretion of IL-10, standard and leukoreduced products. Those recipients showed a very robust increase in IL-10 secretion in culture, while the leukoreduced irradiated group, very fewer patients in that group show that increase. When we look at variant NKT cells, again, the recipients of standard and leukoreduced products really didn't look any different. They showed very few patients in the group that got the leukoreduced irradiated who showed an increase in these regulatory cells. And the same pattern was seen when we looked then at cells in the T regulatory cell subsets of the FOXP3 positive or CTLA4 positive. That really there was very little difference in recipients for standard and leukoreduced products, while leukoreduced irradiated did not generate these cells to the same extent post-transfusion. Next slide, please. So this difference in responses to leukoreduced and leukoreduced irradiated products was really unexpected. In fact, we thought leukoreduced irradiated would look like the leukoreduced, maybe even more so. So we were left with some questions, and so what cells really were affected by irradiation in the leukoreduced components? Were they removed, or did their function change? And we observed an increase in ELIS's sensitization in these recipients of leukoreduced irradiated compared to recipients of leukoreduced. And did this decrease in immunosuppression actually lower the threshold for allosensitization and allowing that antibody production in these recipients of leukoreduced irradiated? But I think one of the major take-homes of our study is caution really is needed in interpreting immune response in cardiac surgery patients. Surgery bypass by itself increased antibody production in pre-sensitized patients, the number of cells producing TGF-beta1, regulatory cytokine production, and numbers of invariant NKT cells. It had little or no effect, though, on the adaptive immune response on Tregs. Next slide. I think it's my last one. So I'd like to thank you for your attention and listening to our study and open this up for questions.
Great. That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Karen. That's really interesting. Again, you could put your questions into the chat room, or you can take yourself off mute and ask questions directly. Maybe I'll pile in since I've got the floor. I'm just curious. We have a number of blood banks in Canada that are receiving leukoreduced platelets from the blood operators and then automatically irradiate everything. And looking at these data, I wonder whether this is a practice that needs to be revisited.
Well, I think it's interesting. This is a small study. And if you've got a situation where you could make those, those comparisons in Canada, I really encourage you to do so, because this is unexpected enough that I think it really does need to be confirmed and expanded. We were really surprised that there was a difference, and I can't tell you, but since this study both had red cells as well as platelets, whether more of the effect came from irradiating the red cell product than irradiating the platelet product. But there have been reports about irradiating of platelet products and having that to have some. And I know Dr. Schlichter's preclinical studies in the dog transfusion studies, she did find that gamma radiation of the platelet product in her transfusion studies did lead to a different outcome than the platelets, unirradiated platelets alone.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we have some questions coming up in the chat. We have a question. Have your findings changed practice within your institution with respect to disallowing irradiated products when they're not indicated?
So the practice in the institution would be the practice in the clinical groups, who are the ones, again, who ordered all of these products. In some instances, they're ordering, they're accepting fewer irradiated products perhaps for their patients. In any case, it was as an effort to modify and control the inventory for the cardiac surgery patients. It wasn't one of the main choices. They weren't required for any of those patients, but again, they accepted them in order to prevent outdates, in platelet products and everything in the institution as a whole. I'm not sure that, again, with some of the immunosuppression pieces, since leukoreduced and standard both gave some of the same outcomes as far as the immunosuppression effects. I don't think there's been a choice really about what to do. And I think I think they're waiting for a larger study and more consensus from the field before they would make any great clinical
policy decisions. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
And I think the other piece I want to just jump in real quick, Dana, is most of the patients who get the irradiated products in our teams are the patients who are undergoing stem cell transplantation or who have compromised immune systems. And we didn't have those subjects in this study. So we can't say that they would have the same immunological response to the irradiated product as these fully immunocompetent patients that we were studying.
Yeah, sure. So obviously there's lots we still don't know about this. There's a couple other questions here. One was about the age of the blood products used for transfusion.
Right. So that we had mandated that none of the products, the red cells, could be greater than 28 days. I think we had 5 instances during the study where that was crossed just because, again, of inventory reasons. That was all that was allowed. But yeah, we did that. We did an analysis trying to see whether the age of the product, but there were just too many variables in this study then to have age of product be, because there was also, even though there was a mean of 3 red cells that was transfused to any of the transfused groups, it's, again, adding another variable about the age and overlaying it. We thought, oh, this is great. We're going to find out with this data, we're going to be able to take a look at whether the aged products really are more indicative of it. But that didn't turn out. And again, small numbers.
Okay, thanks. And then just one last question. There's a question here wondering whether you were able to evaluate and correlate your findings with clinical impacts such as infection rates in the patients.
The study was not planned with that in mind. And so, no, we were not able to in this case.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much.
I may say that adverse events, at least as we knew, patients who had to drop out of study, post-surgery because of clinical case, really they were evenly distributed through all the arms and not in just one arm of the study.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Really interesting data set.
Right. Well, thanks for the opportunity.
I see hands clapping in the box. Very good. Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to move on now to our next talk, which is going to be given by Dr. Nareg Roubinian, who I think is with us. Dr. Roubinian is a pulmonary and intensive care clinician and research investigator at Vitalant Research Institute. Vitalant is the renamed Blood Systems. So this is one of the second largest provider of blood and blood products in the United States. Nareg also has a research appointment at the Kaiser Permanente Northern California Division of Research. So this is how he can do his translational research, and is also an associate professor at the University of California at San Francisco. His research is focused on clinical and laboratory factors in blood donors, in blood components, and in the patients that receive them that are relevant to the efficacy and the potential harm of blood transfusion. And Nareg is going to be giving us a talk today about blood donor component recipient linkages and red blood cell transfusion efficacy outcomes. All yours, Nareg.
Good morning. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yep.
Great. Well, thank you to the organizing committee for the invitation to speak today. It's known that red blood cells are complex biological products with variation between units that should be expected, as we know that blood donors are demographically and genetically diverse. We also know that there are differences in stress-induced hemolysis at the end of red blood cell storage, and recent studies have shown that biological traits such as blood donor sex, age, and race, as well as component processing and modifications, contribute to both variations in the hemoglobin content of red cell units as well as their propensity to hemolyze. Prior observational and randomized clinical trials have focused really on the impact of prolonged red cell storage on morbidity and mortality outcomes. The more recent studies are using big data approaches to evaluate combinations of blood donor component and recipient characteristics. So these linked data are to some degree were inspired by laboratory investigations showing therapeutic effects related to the infusion of blood from young mice into older mice. Studies showing that included anatomical joining of circulatory systems of young and aged mice, transfusion of plasma, or the administration of identified cofactors resulting in both morphological and functional changes to neurological and cardiovascular systems in mice. And these investigations have further inspired age-related diseases in humans, but also raised the question regarding the impact that blood donor factors may have on transfusion recipient outcomes. So to date, there have been a number of observational studies that have linked information from blood collection facilities and transfusion services with recipient data and patient outcomes, so-called vein-to-vein databases, conceptually linking data from the vein of the blood donor to the vein of the transfusion recipient. And they include data from donor donation databases, including demographics, social behaviors, medical history on each donation, with collection, manufacturing, and processing data of blood products, and then linking these to data on transfusion recipients, electronic health records, registries, claims data, including data from hospitals and clinics, which often include health outcomes of transfused patients. So while significant research is focused individually on blood donors and donor health, or on component manufacturing and storage, or optimal transfusion practice, really the interplay between these factors on transfusion safety and efficacy are not really well understood or explored. So studies could conceivably examine the interactions between the role of donor demographics or measures of in vitro hemolysis, donor genetic polymorphisms, and how those are modified by a collection method, additive solutions, timing of leukoreduction, the advent or timing of gamma irradiation, pathogen reduction, and storage duration, as well as recipient characteristics, demographics, prior transfusion exposure, risk for alloimmunization, comorbidities in immune function, and those impacts on measures of morbidity and mortality. So to date, there have been a number of linked donor component recipient databases that have been developed. I'll touch on analyses of several that constructed in Canada and Scandinavia, the Netherlands, and in the United States, each of which to some degree captures various elements of the blood donor component recipient continuum. But what is apparent is that these studies conducted in separate institutions have resulted in conflicting results, with studies from the United States and Scandinavia not identifying associations between blood donor factors and patient mortality, while results of studies conducted in Canada and Dutch studies have shown associations with one or more of donor age, donor transfusion recipient sex mismatch, or donor parity. And some of these conflicting results really highlights limitations of observational research, be it due to missingness of selected data or accuracy of electronic health records and diagnoses that are captured from the EHR, geographical or temporal differences, recognizing that blood is collected, stored, and allocated differently in different countries, and that these processes may have changed over time. And then that exposures or outcomes may be rare despite the large size of these data sets, raising issues of type 1 statistical error, or comparing and contrasting the clinical versus the statistical significance of particular findings. What really highlighted is that and seems to be the most critical issue, is that the choice of statistical design and statistical methods appears to be quite critical. And this is a process, an approach that continues to develop in a collaborative process. So it was recognized that blood donor factors such as donor age and sex are not considered routinely in blood allocation. So their assignment to transfuse patients was considered to be random. And in fact, when investigators examined this, the relationship of the number of transfusions and the receipt of an uncommon donor or component variable, be it from a young or an old donor or a prolonged stored unit, that relationship appeared to be linear. However, the relationship between the total number of transfusions a patient received and adverse outcomes such as death was not found to be linear. And it's recognized that the sicker a patient is, the more transfusions are likely often needed, and then the higher likelihood of an adverse outcome. And this relationship between patient disease severity and transfusion exposure is very difficult to account for observationally, and is recognized to be a common source of confounding in observational studies of transfusion, and to some degree promoted the conduct of randomized clinical trials of transfusion practice and storage age. So the need to appropriately adjust for these factors in linked studies was really nicely shown by Gustav Edgren in a study published 3 years ago. He examined the role of blood donor age on transfusion recipient mortality. And he showed that using an approach of adjusting for the number of transfusions using linear or log linear methods, identified an association between the exposure to red blood cell units from young blood donors and transfusion recipient mortality, with higher mortality in recipients of blood from young donors and lower mortality in recipients from older donors. Now, it's worth pointing out that this association was unexpected and to some degree opposite of the findings identified in the mouse models, which I started with. However, after more appropriate adjustment for the total number of transfusions using either categorical or restricted cubic spline approaches, this association between blood donor age and patient mortality was no longer present. And he conducted similar analyses and with similar findings when examining exposure to red blood cell units from based upon donor sex. So this work was followed by a publication from investigators in the Netherlands, summarized on the panel on the left, that showed that red blood cells from previously pregnant female blood donors were associated with increased mortality, but only in a subset of younger male transfusion recipients. And it should be pointed out that historically, plasma transfusions from multiparous donors had been associated with transfusion-related acute lung injury, at least prior to donor mitigation, but that finding was not apparent in red blood cells. So this was a novel and somewhat striking finding, but there were some issues regarding the small sample size of some of the subgroups and issues with missing data that really merited corroboration in other cohorts. So we therefore conducted a collaborative analysis in 3 separate cohorts, including patients from a community hospital setting in Kaiser Permanente, Northern California, university hospital setting as part of the REG3 network, and then the binational cohort of Sweden and Denmark as part of the SCANDAT cohort. And in our somewhat larger study, using a fully time-dependent Cox model, counting the total number of transfused units for these various exposures, with the summary hazards ratios shown on the right panel, all centering around one, we really found no associations between donor sex or parity with transfused patient mortality. However, none of these prior studies really examined the potential role of component modifications on mortality. In a nicely conducted study by the group in Toronto, investigators found increased mortality in transfusion recipients of fresh whole blood, but not prolonged stored blood or fresh red cell filtered collections. And this was a very well conducted study using multivariable Cox modeling and time varying covariates of daily hemoglobin and creatinine levels, really granular patient data that should be the model for these types of analyses. But their finding was in a subgroup of patients that really represented a small subset of the total transfusion exposures, and thus may be prone to confounding. So this study has not yet been followed up and merits further corroboration. So given the conflicting results from some of these various studies that have been focused on transfusion recipient mortality, it seemed relevant to ask what are the appropriate outcome variables in studies of red cell transfusion. So these studies are focused on mortality, which is clearly a serious but perhaps insensitive to the effects of transfusion. There's clearly been a focus on trying to identify markers of tissue oxygenation, which should be quite relevant physiologically in regard to transfusion, but these measures have been difficult to correlate. So we decided to pursue an analysis examining hemoglobin increments following transfusion, really a direct outcome of red cell transfusion. We conducted an analysis and a linkage analysis in using blood donor component data with transfusion recipients within Kaiser Permanente, Northern California over approximately 9-year period. And what we found linking and examined the outcomes relative to single unit red blood cell transfusions, finding that the overall and somewhat expected outcome was approximately 1 gram per deciliter, but really the historical teaching for the overall effect of transfusions on hemoglobin levels. However, what we found were that individual blood donor component and recipient characteristics played an individual role in multivariable analysis, with larger hemoglobin increments from red cell units from male blood donors, from younger blood donors, from both donors and recipients with positive RHD status, and smaller hemoglobin increments from double red cell apheresis collections in stored in additive solution 3, gamma irradiated units, as well as units stored for more than 35 days. And lastly, recipient characteristics that seem to relate to circulating blood volumes or the overall red cell mass of the patient were associated with changes in hemoglobin levels. So this approach really allowed us to also examine clinical outcomes for variables that have been associated with in vitro hemolysis in prior studies. For example, gamma irradiation has been shown to increase plasma-free hemoglobin in the supernatant of red cell units, and this is likely due to in vitro hemolysis. In our study, we found smaller hemoglobin increments in recipients of gamma irradiated red blood cells. However, there were no appreciable differences in relation to storage duration of these red cells, nor in relation to donor sex or time from gamma irradiation, individual variables which in prior in vitro studies have been associated with hemolysis. It should also be noted that gamma irradiated red cell units are frequently transfused to patients with hematologic malignancies. This is essentially a form. So we thought it was important and relevant to examine hemoglobin increments in patients with and without oncologic diagnoses. And we found similar findings with decreased hemoglobin increments in recipients of irradiated red cells, irrespective of this comorbidity. We then began to look at combinations of donor component and recipient factors, finding significant variation in hemoglobin increments following single red cell transfusions. For example, blood from unirradiated or whole blood collections from male blood donors transfused to female recipients was associated with a significantly larger hemoglobin increment from irradiated or double red apheresis collection from female donors transfused to male recipients. over an approximately 0.5 gram per deciliter difference in these parameters. So we thought the logical next step was to pursue a multivariable analysis, including all donor component recipient factors. And when we examined sort of some of the extremes of these associations, the differences in hemoglobin increments were quite striking, over 1 gram per deciliter. So these modeling approaches could conceivably have some use in patient blood management practice or in resource limited settings, but also raise the question of the role of donor and component variables in the conduct of multi-center clinical trials of red cell transfusion, which often use multiple blood suppliers that may collect, process, and store blood components differently. A number of recent studies have also provided additional supporting evidence that blood donor behaviors, including donor smoking, alcohol use, and caffeine intake, impact red blood cell quality. And this was a series of recent publications by Angelo D'Alessandro from the University of Colorado, using metabolomic approaches on the REDS3 RBComics cohort, identified significant variation related to these donor behaviors. More recently, some of these findings have been correlated in transfused patients. A pilot study conducted at Cornell found that gamma-irradiated red blood cell units from smokers, based upon cotinine positivity, were associated with smaller post-transfusion hemoglobin increments in univariate analyses. A follow-up analysis that we conducted collaboratively within Kaiser Permanente, where we also analyzed concomitant donor component and recipient factors, and in a multivariable analysis also found that smaller hemoglobin increments occurred in transfusion recipients of irradiated but not unirradiated red blood cell units from smokers. And this suggested that there may potentially be additive effects of donor smoking and gamma irradiation on red blood cell quality. And interestingly, this finding was further augmented with prolonged storage of these red cell units from irradiated units from donor smokers. Genetic differences in blood donors may also affect red cell storage and post-transfusion recovery. While prolonged storage duration may have an overall small impact on the hemoglobin increment, specific donor genetic polymorphisms such as G6PD deficiency may be clinically relevant, especially in susceptible patients such as individuals with sickle cell disease. That donor genetic diversity may impact clinical outcomes, in part inspired the conduct of the REDS3 RBComics study, which is a large-scale study applying omics approaches to phenotypic measures of red cell hemolysis at the end of storage. This study of more than 13,000 racially and ethnically diverse adult blood donors found that rates of hemolysis varied among donors across sex, age, racial subgroups, as well as donation frequency. And many of these studies are ongoing. But the study also found that the rates of intrinsic in vitro hemolysis were reproducible and suggested at least a partially heritable basis for hemolysis. So using this finding, as well as a GWAS that was conducted as part of the study to correlate donor genetic polymorphisms with these measures of in vitro hemolysis, we are currently embarking on work to link the blood donor hemolytic phenotype as well as donor genetic polymorphisms with the full REDS3 blood donor component recipient database, as part of work of the REDS4P program, as well as within Kaiser Permanente. The hypothesis is that that donor hemolysis phenotype or variability in donor genes encoding red cell proteins will have a clinical impact on outcomes of transfusion that have been associated with hemolysis. And for this study, we're examining changes in hemoglobin, bilirubin, and creatinine levels following single unit red cell transfusions. As part of the REDS3 RBComics study, there was also work to develop a polygenic risk score to quantify donors' inherited risk of hemolysis, essentially a score to summarize the cumulative effects of multiple genetic polymorphisms. In a pilot study which we conducted within Kaiser Permanente, where we adjusted for other donor component recipient factors, we found that increased polygenic risk for osmotic hemolysis was associated with smaller hemoglobin increments following transfusion. So the recipients of blood from donors with the highest polygenic risk had the smallest hemoglobin increments following transfusion. So while lastly, the work that I presented to date is really focused on the associations of donor component and recipient characteristics of single unit red cell transfusions, ongoing studies are examining repeated donor and component exposures on more longitudinal patient outcomes beyond hemoglobin increments or measures of hemolysis. That includes the need and timing of subsequent red cell transfusions, changes in kidney function, hospital length of stay, as well as rates of infection in transfused patients. So on by summarizing that these linked blood donor component recipient databases provide unique opportunities to study exposures relevant to transfusion safety and efficacy. When examining that it's clear that these analyses are complex, and it's key to account for confounding when examining patient morbidity and mortality outcomes. Linking these data with genotype and phenotype data are needed to better understand mechanisms of identified clinical associations, and really collaboration and corroboration of these studies are critical to really a better understanding of these associations. I'd like to finish by acknowledging colleagues and collaborators at Vitalant Research Institute and UCSF, as well as members of the REDS 3 and 4P programs, Kaiser Permanente Division of Research, as well as colleagues at Scandat in Denmark and Sweden. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nareg. Really interesting. This is open for questions, and again, you could type your questions into the chat box, and or you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Maybe I'll get a first one in. I'm just curious. This is really getting quite detailed, and you can see that we'll be in a place at some point where we've got a mix of algorithms around either how we manage the donor or how we label the blood product for use in particular patients. Where do you see all of this going?
Yeah, I think I think that point in criticism is or that critique is a good one. I think, you know, to date we are identifying small granular changes in transfusion outcomes, but the broader impact on patient outcomes is really not clear. And it's recognized that the work and effort, to some degree as part of clinical research programs such as the REDS 4P program to weigh donor units or assess the red cell mass of a collected component, which may conceivably impact the patient outcomes, is a complex process. So I think it's, to some degree, it's a work in progress in the sense of understanding what are the roles or the outcomes associated with donor genetic polymorphisms or measures of hemolysis in both the donor and the recipient on broader patient outcomes.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question from the chat room. How do you determine polygenic risk for hemolysis?
So it's a complex process. So the polygenic risk score, which was a work of bioinformaticist Dr. Greer Page, is beyond my understanding, but my limited understanding is that there are a number of single nucleotide polymorphisms, and these are weighed relative. These were correlated with the in vitro measures of osmotic or oxidative hemolysis. So both the prevalence and the strength of those associations, as well as the number of risk alleles for each of these genetic variants, is taken into account in developing this essentially normally distributed polygenic risk score. I wish I could speak more intelligently beyond my understanding, but it's sort of it's a budding field within genomics, and there have been recent publications examining polygenic risk for thrombosis or other patient outcomes, in some sense summarizing the data and knowledge related to individual SNP risk for a clinical outcome.
Great. Thanks very much, Nareg. Are there any other questions? Okay, if not, we're due for a